Hi, welcome to the Conversant Podcast, conversations in theology, church, culture, and mission. My name's Mark Norridge, I'm the host of this podcast. I'm also the principal of King's School of Theology and part of the leadership of River Collective, a movement of churches in Northamptonshire. In this podcast, I talk to all sorts of interesting people around the issues of theology, church, culture, and mission, drawing particularly on those who tutor at King's School of Theology. My hope is that through our engaging conversations, we will equip, inspire, and provoke good conversations wherever you are. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Conversant Podcast, conversations in theology, church, culture, and mission. Really excited today to be talking about transforming culture and the tensions that we find as we think about how to do that from a missional point of view. I'm joined by my very good friends, Mark Mumford and Rich Cummings, to talk about this issue. And I really hope that you enjoy the podcast episode today. Let's just meet the guys, meet the team. Rich, why don't you kick us off? Who are you? Where do you live? What do you get up to?
I'm Rich. I live in Exeter. I lead Isca Church in Exeter. I'm also part of the team behind a kind of community charity and community centre in the northeast of Exeter, doing all sorts of community neighbourhood work, serving all sorts of people. Love learning about theology, politics, culture. Love playing football. Love playing games.
Okay, nice. Football. Are you any good at the football?
Turns out I'm a little bit rusty. I've started playing with a new group of guys. It turns out I'm absolutely rubbish at shooting, but I can pass a ball in a straight line. So that's something, and I can run occasionally. How about that?
Very good. Great to have you on the on the podcast, Rich. Thanks for joining us. Real practitioner, because I think this morning you were actually, doing community work and things like that, weren't you? I was sitting here talking about it, but I think you possibly were actually doing it.
I was having a go. Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of meat and drink. I love, this morning was about chatting with various people in all sorts of situations of life. Sometimes trying to offer advice, sometimes just listening, being a friend, sometimes just being a companion and shooting a bit of pool, whatever it is. But just trying to be present with people this morning and loving it.
I did join you for one of those, didn't I? But I beat the guy at pool, and I think I offended him. I think I set your mission back, years, I think.
Oh, no, it was wonderful. You shut him up for a while, which is sorely needed. So, no, that was fantastic. You came and defeated him in his trash talk. I loved every minute of that.
Very good. Great. And also, Mark Mumford, great to have you joining. Where are you, Mark? And what do you get up to?
So I now live in Worcester, having lived in Derby for 40 years and been involved, obviously, in church there. I've officially what's called retired, although nobody quite knows what retirement means these days. So I live in Worcester, and I kind of look to encourage and serve churches as and when I still can, and to improve my golf, which is taking a lot more than I thought it would to improve.
Oh, okay. Wow. Yeah, I don't think I'd win any golf medals. Pool, I'm okay with. Golf, less so. Oh, I'm trying.
You guys can talk about pool.
Any handicap yet, Mark?
I've got a handicap, but I'm not talking about that one right now. Okay.
Okay, all right. That's a bit of a show. Fair enough. Cool. Okay. Also just a little bit of your involvement with KST would be really good. As you know, on this show, we like to pull in people who are involved in King's School of Theology. Mark, why don't you kick us off? What's your involvement with KST?
So, I mean, obviously in its different manifestations and actually slightly different names it's had over the years, I have been involved from the early 90s onwards, and used to just come and do some little module of teaching within the course at the time. I think, though, over the more recent years, I've been on the exec of the board of KST, And I see myself really as a supportive role, supportive person. I'm as a church person through and through. I am absolutely totally committed to the work of KST. But we're talking particularly about a module here about changing culture and so on, and mission, transforming mission. And that's probably been my heart for a long, long time, 20 years or so, is like how to be truly missional as church, and not to sort of section it off as a something on the side, but actually in its very heart for the church to be missional. So that's all been my kind of my passion, my interest. And in recent times, I just enjoy being around the KST and giving a little bit of support here and there where I can.
Excellent, and a good support you are, for sure, definitely. What about you, Rich? What about your involvement with KST?
Well, I was graduated a few years ago. I was so appreciative of KST. It really affected me in my leadership and my attitudes to all sorts of areas of theology. And I particularly love doing the mission track. And so I kind of joke every time, don't I, that I join in every year, that basically I'm just a repeat student now pretending to be a teacher on the mission track. But I do just love joining in the conversation. I love reminding myself of all the different facets of what it means to be a church on mission, be a disciple on mission, and love kind of sharing ideas and exploring ideas with new people every year. It's just a lot of fun. So glad to join in with that part of the team.
Yeah. That's great. I was talking to someone just yesterday, and they just love hearing your practical, worked out examples of what it looks like there in Exeter, Rich. It's really, really good, and some good, innovative approaches to mission that maybe we'll hear about a bit more another time, because we're not going to do that today. Sorry to say. One last thing on intros, then. I like to ask this question. It's kind of, a theology or, kind of podcast. So I'm going to ask a bit of a booky question. What is the last book that you read? Rich.
Well, I knew you were going to ask this, and I'm afraid I'm going to be tricky because I always have 3 books on the go at any one time. I have something that's around psychology, politics, something that's a bit about theology, and a bit of fiction. Fiction-wise, at the moment, I'm working my way through the C.J. Sansom Shardlake series, which is about 16th century theology, politics, and murder mystery, and it is fantastic. So I really recommend that. I just finished The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, and that is just fascinating, looking at how we find language and conversation around morality and ethics today, how we break down silos. And theology-wise, I recently finished Lucy Papiet's book on discipleship, which is a really interesting and practical read. Really recommend it.
Very good. That might be the best answer we've ever had. So that's very good.
Whatever
Mark,
I say now is going to just sound so lightweight and trivial, isn't it? Isn't it? Just
yeah, that's true. Sorry, I've gone to you first.
Last book. It just happens to be a book somebody gave me just the other day, so I've started to read it. It's just simply called Dare to Believe, and it's actually the story of Sat7, the missions broadcast organization, which I think is absolutely amazing and wonderful. And so I know a little bit about that, but it's just interesting to start to read that story. I've got other books that I would say Mark, you asked what book has been on the shelf that you keep meaning to read. Is that right? Or you should read at some point. There's been a book on my shelf called The Rest of God, which is about Sabbath and so on, by Mark Buchanan. It's been there for absolutely ages, and I've never found enough time and rest to be able to read it. So I'm actually going to commit myself to reading that, finding something else about Sabbath. But if I was to say favourite authors, I think it's Tozer. I think I just love reading Tozer. I find him so prophetic, challenging, and deep, really. So
very good. Yeah. Does he fall under your next question then, Mar, which is to you, your favourite Christian? Who's your favourite Christian?
Favourite Christian? Yeah. And I'm not allowed to say my mum or anything like that. Okay, but
if you want,
I think. Do you know what? When
she was my teacher, wasn't she? Your mum, anyway.
Yeah, she was. She taught you, Mark. Look what happened.
Yeah.
I suppose when I think about that, I just think about people who've got longevity. And so some of the guys I've met in recent years who have been older and have now gone on to be with the Lord, people like George Verwer, Brother Andrew once, actually, Michael Green. I found all those guys hugely inspirational. And I think part of it is because they kept their passion right through to the very end. It was like, I used to say, coming to these guys, they're running on Duracell batteries. And I think just because perhaps stage of life I'm at, but also I'm just looking at going, these are heroes because I've seen an awful lot crash and fall and burn along the way or fade. And to see these guys actually still in full on and really sort of pushing on with their sense of mission for the Lord right into the very, very old age, I just found hugely inspiring. So I'd put those kind of guys into that category. That's okay.
Nice. Good answer. Rich, what about you? Favourite Christian?
I regret I don't have a definite one, but a couple of people who come to mind today. One is just a lady called Debbie, who was a youth worker for me when I grew up. And her sense of compassion, her sense of understanding, and her love for God just shone through at a very important time when life was going through a sticky patch. So very grateful for her. And I guess in more recent years, there's a woman in our church called Sheila Tremaine, who was a missionary to Brazil, and her sense of faith and courage, sense of adventure, trust in God was just next level. I have never come across it in a person ever. And yet she was so humble. I was telling somebody the other day, she used to let me come and visit her, have lunch with her, and let me work in her home for an afternoon, and then just have a cup of tea with her. Just fantastic. And yet just had this amazing experience and legacy behind her of first white person in Amazon, Brazil. Just incredible.
Wow.
So, yeah, brilliant.
Very good. Very good. Very people we've met. We've not always had people we've met when people have answered that question. So I like that. Thanks for that. So moving on to our kind of subject for today then. So we are looking at transforming culture. And really the reason to do this as a subject is because the three of us were just delivering this module, weren't we, at KST a couple of weeks ago. And just had a brilliant time in investigating transforming culture. Why do that? What is that about? What is culture anyway? All of these really big questions, which we covered in that module. And I guess one of the aspects of what we looked at that I felt like we didn't really get into. It's always there on our kind of schedule, but we're ramming so much into this module. We talk about four kind of tensions that there are when we think about the idea of transforming culture. And so I thought for this podcast, we could just talk through those four tensions, discuss them a bit together, and think about, I guess we're kind of assuming that transforming culture's something of a missional endeavor that we should be part of. So that's a bit of a given, probably, given we taught a module on it. But yeah, there's tensions within that. And so we're going to look at those four tensions. I think I had a slide on each one at in the module itself. We never got there. So we're doing it now. I think I'll just outline them, the four we're going to do. The first tension is personal salvation versus transforming society. So there's a tension there between how much you go for the individual and how much you're aiming for society as a whole. Maybe that does question the premise of that. The second one is church on the margins versus church in the center. Another tension that can be discussed within transforming culture. Third one is a church in weakness versus a church in power. And then lastly, is it about building a better world, or is it about being a better church? So there we go. Those are the four things we're going to talk about, but we'll start at the top. Why don't you, Mark, lead us off on that? What do you think about this tension, personal salvation versus transforming society?
Yeah, I can do a little bit on this, actually, because I think it's a little journey for myself along the way over the years. I think this idea that the gospel is bigger than we think it is. There's a sort of an idea, that the world actually often would tell us Stay in your, no, keep Christianity where it's supposed to be, personal, a personal issue. Keep it just to you and your own personal devotional life. That's what Christianity is all about. And I've had a friend over many years now, some people may know, Dave Stroud, who's been carrying an agenda for the fact that God's heart is actually not just for personal salvation, but the impact of where it begins with personal salvation, but the impact is that God's heart is for the whole of creation, for all things to be restored and renewed for him. And so I think this is actually an interesting one. I kind of tend to just very simply talk about it as three concentric circles. Like if you drop a stone into a pool of water, it's like the heart of the gospel obviously begins with the human heart. It begins with an individual. It begins with individual personal salvation. So we can't say it starts out there and rolls inwards. And I believe that's important. We keep that centering right, that actually we're not looking at, say, we're just involved in just, say, doing social good somewhere. But the purpose and the motive comes from a renewed heart, a renewed person. But to say then that's it, that's what the gospel's for. Let's just have lots and lots of individuals who have been personally renewed, I think denies the power of the mission of gospel that we've got. Because as the stone drops into the water, if you like, the ripples start to come out. And so we got these perhaps three different kind of spheres, I think, that happen. Personal renewal is the start, first one. But personal renewal rolls out almost immediately into social renewal, which is that if you've got renewed people with new renewed hearts, they start to behave differently in society. They start to do things differently. They start to care differently. If they carry the heart of Jesus, here's number one, love God with all your heart and soul, mind and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So immediately there's a social implication. And that's resulted, I think, over the years with Christianity showing itself perhaps at its best, where it's fed the poor and cared for the marginalized and served the weak and so on. And even today, I think that's a wonderful, wonderful testimony to this gospel that ripples outwards and has a social effect, if you like. But I think what we're talking about actually goes beyond that, because it's not just we just do good to mop up the mess of the world, the mess the world is in, and the mess that the world produces. But actually it goes further out than that and says, actually, there's a place to reshape, to actually renew the whole of the culture that we live in. And that, when I begin to touch on that, it actually touches on art and the politics and business and the kind of whole of creation. And again, I can hear the sound sometimes of the world that would say, hey, get back in your box, stay out of this. And yet I believe here's the heart of something that God wants us to be doing, which is to see the whole of creation being affected. So I think that's my personal conviction and a bit of a journey that I've been on to see what I think is the power of the gospel going outwards in those concentric circles.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so you'd kind of seen that. I know you kind of see that as a move over time, really, haven't you? In your experience of church is to really embrace those concentric circles more and more. It's something, particularly in your church context, that
exactly.
I feel like it's changed over.
I mean, my life has not been an academic one. My life has been very much a church practitioner. I kind of, I love the church and so on. So to see, actually, I think one of the things I do on this course is I just give a bit of context. I go, here's some recent 50-year context of our journey that really has gone that sort of journey. We've been focusing on personal renewal as the main thing and the only thing almost. Let's populate the church with more and more people, and that's the goal. To actually seeing that, no, if the church is really living out this gospel, it has a social impact, has a social effect. But it's taken us a journey to get to there. Well, I think where we are today is saying actually that the ripples go further. They go out even more and takes us into all kinds of arenas that ultimately is about transforming culture, shaping culture. So I can see that journey, feel like that's been my personal journey. And I mentioned this friend called Dave Stroud who runs a conference which is called Everything. And I think, well, people say, well, what's it about?
What does it do? What does it cover? Yeah.
What's it about? Well, let's just say it's about everything. And I love that. I love that
Everything.
whole kind of thing. It's the whole earth. It's the whole world and everything in it. It's like the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. And I suppose I just love that. It gives a sense of a much greater sense of mission and purpose that flows out rather than just, I mean, although never want to reduce it, but just like getting people across the line as our ultimate, is that it? Is that the goal? And so, well, I think the goal is to see, yeah, of course, to see people become personally renewed. What a wonderful thing. But the consequences and the effect of that gospel to be increasingly going out into all things.
Interesting. Do you think there's a tension in that, Rich? Like, is there a tension between that personal and the bigger vision?
Yeah, I think there is, and I think there are contrasting ways to look at this. I think a case against what Mark's saying could be built. I'm not necessarily saying I'm behind it, but I do think you can explore other ways of looking at it, and you might. I think the pond analogy some people might dispute and say, well, actually, it could be reverse ripples. My case for that would be what we looked at in the mission weekend that we started with Genesis 1 and the mandate for God called mankind to steward the earth, and that was our kind of starting point, as what we said was the kind of the cultural mandate from the dawn of time. And that would indicate that actually before you do anything around salvation and kind of personal transformation, there is a prerequisite that every day of my life I am in the business of transforming culture. And as a necessity and as a result of that, personal salvation and personal transformation will come. But actually the building block is to say, well, my very posture is, as the moment I get my head up out of bed and set foot on the ground, I am being invited to shape, influence, and contribute to culture. And I guess that's where I think there's the interest can come, and where that tension lies for me. That's where I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess the other thing of that is that there are times when that maybe parts of the world, maybe our own part of the world, where we see lots of personal transformation, but it doesn't ripple out.
Yeah.
That's another thing. I mean, is that like, is it an inevitability, Mark? Do you think that it ripples out in the way you described?
I think that's a really good point. I think that's a really good point. There's lots of places where, the Christian population is huge, and yet the social transformation or the cultural transformation hasn't happened at all. So I think it is not just a question of where it starts and finishes. I think it's an issue of revelation, if you like, and of understanding that actually this is part of our gospel. So I can accept that it can come different ways. I'm just slightly kind of where I've journeyed. I actually began almost as a child and growing up with something which was called the social gospel. And that kind of sounds a good thing. Let's do the good things and then just see where they lead us, if you like. But what it actually resulted in often was crossless Christianity, was a Christianity without Christ at the center, without any kind of personal in relationship with Christ. It was like, let's do good. And then if you do good, so you start to lean towards this idea that good works somehow is like credits and so that's why I kind of stick with the ripple idea, even though I can understand how it could be interpreted different ways, because I just think Jesus would every now and again go like, let me just remind you, the kingdom of God, where does it begin? Oh, it begins within you. And without a personal transformation, I think what happens is by the time we get to cultural transformation, we're talking about the common good. In other words, what are we doing there? We're doing something there not just to get more people into our church. It's not a particular, if you like, church growth model. It's actually for the common good. We want this for the good of people so that they might live in a better world. So that might jump into one of the other questions that we're looking at. Yeah.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Yeah, tension. So it ripples out. Does it also ripple in? I guess one other thing on this is that movement from the social gospel, and then a gospel that relates in what, effectively a kind of legalism. That we can be so much on the outer rings that actually we forget the middle one as well. I think we talked about that a little bit, and I often have that kind of conversation with church leaders where they go, well, we're doing this lovely, community action thing, but are we seeing the personal transformation that we think is part of this as well, I suppose, and whether this pendulum swings, back and forth a little bit and reflecting that tension. Don't know.
I think it could do. I mean,
absolutely.
obviously I love looking back over. I grew up in a Methodist church. I just love looking back over that kind of Wesleyan revival that took place centuries ago. But it just feels like it was a classic and a wonderful, large scale example of where the pursuit originally was of personal renewal. Wesley's pursuit was like for holiness and for individual salvation. But the Methodists became known for those who did good. They gave their lives to the poor and the marginalized and so on and so on. But it is like these ripples rolled out eventually into, and they'll say it is the effect of that Wesleyan revival that we ended up with Shaftesbury, and we ended up with Wilberforce, and we ended up with all those incredible areas of society that changed the common good for everybody, and even for the good of animals, for heaven's sake. RSPCA and so on. We're all kind of an outflow of this gospel. And I'm going, that's great. That's God's heart. He cares about all of creation and all of us, and he wants that to come from him to out. Right?
Nice. Anything else from you, Rich, on that?
Nah. Go for the next one.
We're done. Okay, let's move on.
Next one.
Yeah, let's get in on the next one. The next one we want to talk about then is church on the margins versus church at the centre. And I think what we're trying to kind of get at, I'll lead on this one, is get at this kind of tension of whether church is right at the centre of society. And particularly we're in the West, we've inherited, or we've been part of this sense of Christendom where church and state are very much aligned. Church is at the centre of society, really kind of, I don't know, blessing what's going on in the centre of society, being part of all the decisions, being right there in the middle, and it's not a surprise for people to know that has begun to break down. That we can talk about being in a post-Christian society or post-Christendom society. Post-Christian kind of means the cultural movement beyond Christianity being the language, if you like, of our culture. Post-Christendom talking more about the structures. So maybe the post-Christendom is what we're talking about today. And whether that's a good thing. Is it a good thing that we're in this post-Christendom thing where church decouples from the structures of government and all of these systems that have been integrated for so long? And maybe it's better that church is back on the margins. When we think of the early church, first couple of 100 years, 300 years of church history, church was a marginal community on the edge of society, very much treated in varying ways, but maybe a bit suspicious, certainly not with power. Although there were people in those churches with power, but as a corporate sense, there was no power. Like maybe that's the tension. I think, isn't it better? Should we be retreating from those institutional places of power and returning to the margins, that more kind of, I don't know, I guess the prophetic sense of what church's role is in society. Maybe if you're too close to the centre, you get a bit co-opted by that. And maybe, that's the argument, I suppose. And I always turn to Stanley Hauerwas in this. My favourite one, a book called Resident Aliens. And I've got his quote here because I love it, and I'm going to pull up every time I possibly can. He says this: Constantinian thinking, so that Christendom thinking, leads Christians to judge their ethical positions not on the basis of what is faithful to our particular tradition, but rather, and this is the bit, but rather on the basis of how much Christian ethics Caesar can be induced to swallow before choking. And I find that brilliant. Like, if this church in the centre wants to go, if we could just get Caesar, which means government, the authorities, we could just get them to swallow our Christian stuff, then we'd be doing our job. And Hauerwas, obviously, as an Anabaptist, is very much no, we should be on the margins of society. What do you guys think? Centre or margins?
Yeah. It's a great kind of tension, isn't it? And you can see, as with all these things that we're going to explore, kind of advantages and disadvantages to both. I find inherently a discomfort with when the church tries to dominate and when Christians try to dominate. And that's one of the things I guess I'm always alert to in some of these conversations. So in the context of culture, and if we're trying to take quite a broad reflection on culture as, the way we do things around here, and all the take into account not just kind of politics and power, but also music and the arts and entertainment and our education and the way we talk to one another. I think in all these cases, there's a risk that the church can try to dominate and force itself as if the way we do things and how we operate is the way everyone else should. And I think the moment we do that, there are just such hazards of pride and arrogance and rolling over others and ignoring the voices of others that in fact potentially harm what God's already doing or inhibit people from joining in God's work. And that's one of the tensions then I would want to look at, is when we say, church at the center of culture, how much are we trying to aggressively claim that center ground and deny others their space in that center with us? Is it an occupation of the center that is collaborative and open and welcoming, or is it exclusive?
Yeah,
interesting. Any response, Mark?
Well, I tend to agree with the main point that Rich is making there. I think, the idea of somehow exercising power as the church has gone badly wrong in the past, and but I think, as we're talking, obviously the point really is, as we kind of learn over on this module, we kind of do some learning. Andy Crouch presents, for instance, one of the great sort of authors on this. He presents 5 different ways that we can approach culture. Can I just run through those kind of quickly? It's just like, we either condemn it, so which means that we stand right on the outside, or we critique it. We kind of just like, or we copy it. We try to get along and just join in with it, or we consume it. But his final one that he suggests is we create. So I suppose what I think is that there are inevitably, just look a little bit back in history and you go, so here we are in Hitler's world. And what do we do in that situation, in that circumstance? How do we stand on the margins? Do we try to get involved in it? Whatever. I think there's times when the prophetic voice is what we're called to be from the margins. Is there other opportunities and times when we, as the church, could influence for good? There may be other times. So I think there's a probably not a fixed answer so much as there's something fluid about culture. The very word, I think, tells us there's something fluid there about it. Can't hear you, Mark.
There might be times to step into the centre, and there might be times to step into the margins of it. I suppose that's what you're saying, and
That's right.
that's a good point. And maybe we don't have to adopt one posture in the midst of that. I'm reflecting on Bonhoeffer in lots of this, because he writes in this a lot, and the idea that for him the church at the centre actually resulted in marginalisation of the church. That was the irony that he picked up, is that this church in the centre, then the centre says, well, you church, you do the spiritual stuff, hatch, match and dispatch, bless us on our way. We as government will do everything else. And he said that's the irony of being in the centre, is that you end up marginalised. And so he talks about, no, you end up on the fringe, but as a result of being on the fringe, you return to the centre knowing that God has got something to say about everything. And obviously Bonhoeffer's writing in the midst of Nazi Germany, and for him, he's saying, I'm not going to be controlled by Hitler. As a church, I want to find our own identity and a particular voice, because one of the voices is not just going to be, bless you, government. It's going to be, no, stop. That's not what you should be up to. So that there's an irony in that, I suppose, isn't there? Of you head into the centre, but you end up marginalised. And I think maybe that's what Hauerwas is trying to pick up in that quote, is to go, you've got to find your own voice. You've actually got to say everything that God is asking you to say, and not just the bits that people want to hear, if that makes sense.
I think we've probably got a fairly common understanding today that Christendom was not necessarily a good thing for the health of the church and for the gospel and so on. So I think we live now in post-Christendom. So whatever was there in Christendom era, we've got to find ourselves in a different posture anyway in the world we live in today. And I think it's interesting question.
Can I keep it beyond just politics, and also just think culture and the arts? And just one other perspective that I just find fascinating to watch is in the realm of hip hop, because of course you look at me, middle-aged white guy, and you think that guy must be into hip hop, because I just ooze hip hop, don't I? But
you do.
But that for me is also a space where there's this tension going on around church at the center and church in the margins, in if we're talking about the breadth of culture and the breadth of life and all the different spaces of life that we can contribute to. A few years back, one of my favorite artists, Chance the Rapper, performed, I think it was at the Grammys, and he performed this absolutely fantastic song, which starts with "How Great Is Our God," and had this great,
the song we all know and love.
Yeah, that amazing song, "How Great Is Our God," and he starts there at the Grammys with this amazing chorus behind him, all just praising God and singing praise and enacting a worship act in front of this audience and these millions of people watching at the Grammys, and then proceeds to perform his song, which is all about the greatness of Jesus. At the Grammys, that for me was a place where church was at the center of culture, but there was this fascinating kind of practice going on in which it is using the form of hip hop, which often can be a vehicle for all sorts of aspects of culture that we might not feel comfortable with. And yet he's there in a kind of positive proclamation space, sharing the love of Jesus in that space. There for me, where I think there's fascinating things, but I like it because he is an artist who is a Christian performing in the space in the center of culture. He is not dominating that space. He's not seeking to kind of say, I am this is Christian music and I'm bringing it to you in an exclusive way. Right. It's bringing space together. And I think that's fascinating. Whereas there's interesting contrast. There's a contrast in the UK. Cliff Richard And how do we compare and contrast some of the contributions of Cliff Richard with something like that? I'm not dissing Cliff
Hey,
Richard. He's a wonderful.
don't judge the past in that way.
I don't want to do that. But you know what I mean? I think there are fascinating things there about the language we use, the music we contribute, what spaces are they occupying, and what messages do they bring? And I think that's all
really
within this space of tension.
Yeah, really helpful to bring that back beyond just engagement with government. I love that. That's really, really good, and it reflects the fact that that's the risk of going on the margins. Is that you end up in your own little world and you create a subculture that actually has got no engagement with transforming culture, any engagement with culture, transforming it or not, at all. And so what you've just described there is countering the risk, I suppose, of being on the margins is that you end up in your own little world.
Yeah. And of course, as you enter that space, there's all sorts of pitfalls. You look at how many people jumped on the bandwagon of celebrating Kanye West when he seemed to be one of us for a while and produced these gospel albums. And suddenly all these people who I've never known like hip hop in their lives are suddenly playing his album. And I'm thinking, what are you doing? And then the guy explodes a bit and there are all sorts of questions about what he's doing. So that's the risk, is that in people seeking these very central platforms, they're flawed human beings who are going to get things wrong and make mistakes. Chance the Rapper is not a perfect Christian by any means. So that's the risk, isn't it? But I think it's hazardous, as you say, to create our subcultures and hide ourselves away and create this perfect little Christian bubble where we do our own thing. Yeah. I think that's just as hazardous as getting in the center of culture with all the mess and all the fragility. There's tensions with both.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Good point.
And we certainly could get talking a lot more about that. Maybe that's for another podcast. But I always think U2 was the radical one band from my upbringing. They were very much known as a Christian band in the really early. Well, no, that's not quite true. They were part of a church that we knew of, and so they knew that people knew that they were Christians. And then I remember it. Oh my goodness, they've released a single in the charts, and is this Christian music or not? What have they? And I heard someone say it was a particular person who. Quite an influential person across lots of churches. And I remember him speaking, going, I told them, that they go that way, it's the wrong way, you need to keep, and this guidance that they should be in the Christian bubble, really. But what band has had influence in cultures at large than U2? And we can get very stuck in our own little Christian world, can't we? That's a really, really good point.
Yeah, that's a great example.
No,
I just love the whole thing that this is what actually happens when we get into this arena. It's about whole different areas of life rather than just the religious, the sacred, if you like. So we start talking about music, and I love hearing about a street artist, who does murals, and the whole kind of area that this lady lived in was full of aggression. So any graffiti or art was just steeped in aggression and anger and so on. And she's become a well-renowned street artist by just saying, no, I'm gonna not religious phrase, but I'm just gonna promote positivity and a kind of heartfelt sort of like for values like unity and joy and so on. And I think that's where the suddenly what she's doing is not separated from her Christian renewal, personal renewal. It's an outflow of that, and it involves these whole areas of life that perhaps we used to separate sacred and secular.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when is it Christian art? Well, it's a ridiculous label, isn't it? Like, is it going to heaven when it dies? Is that the question that you're asking? Like, what does it even mean? And or is it only good art if it communicates the gospel in whatever you might define that as?
Where's the cross?
But what you're saying that it's got to have a cross in it. Yeah, absolutely. Even if it's hidden, so it can really get in people's subconscious. I don't know, but yeah, what if it's just good for good art's sake? What if it's just beauty? What if it's speaking something prophetic into different ways? What if it's just doing good in the world and creating a nice,
And that opens a
more
door,
beautiful
I think,
environment.
to countless Christians who've got artistic gifting given from God, to say, okay, it doesn't just have to be a painting to put in the church building somewhere that's a religious one. There's an expression, you say, of just beauty and just of creativity that actually reflects something of God's heart and nature into the wider world.
Yeah. So we covered two of our tensions when we're looking at transforming culture. We've covered, what have we covered? We've covered personal salvation versus transforming society, and we've covered church on the margins versus church at the centre. To be honest, we probably could have gone on longer on those. Really good. But we are going to move on now. But this is the end of part one. If you want to get the other two tensions that we talk about, then join us for our next podcast coming very soon.